All righty, let's take our Bibles this morning, turn to Proverbs chapter number 23, and as you're turning there, let me put in a huge, giant plug for the Trail of Blood. If you do not have that, you need to get a copy of that. I first came across that years ago when I was on staff, and that one booklet kind of opened my eyes as to the heritage that we enjoy as Baptists. But the thing is, it's not a Baptist-type thing. That's nothing but a name tag that was thrown upon us. They were called Christians first in Antioch, and the Trail of Blood traces that first church established by Christ. It goes historically, looking at the different persecutions brought about by Roman Caesars, all of the different aspects of how Christians went from country to country. They were called Paulicians in one place. They were called the Waldensians in another place. Those were our forefathers, and that just puts a whole different perspective on what we believe and why it has always been a problem with the world. So if you don't have one, if you've not ordered one yet, you really, really need to get one. They are very, very crucial, I think, as far as our faith is concerned. Proverbs chapter number 23 is where we're going to take a look at, and we are going to look at a little bit of an attitude adjustment being given by Solomon here, of course, keeping in mind that he's trying to help his son with this. Proverbs 23, verse number 1, when thou sittest to eat with a ruler, consider diligently what is before thee, and put a knife to thy throat if thou be a man given to appetite. What in the world is the big caution about sitting down and having a meal with somebody? We're going to find out. Verse 3, be not desirous of his dainties, for they are deceitful meat. Labor not to be rich, cease from thine own wisdom. Wilt thou set thine eyes upon that which is not? For riches certainly make themselves wings, they fly away as an eagle toward heaven. Eat thou not the bread of him that hath an evil eye, neither desire thou his dainty meats. For as he thinketh in his heart, so is he. Great verse right there. Eat and drink, saith he to thee, but his heart is not with thee. The morsel which thou hast eaten shalt thou vomit up, and lose thy sweet words. Speak not in the ears of a fool, for he will despise the wisdom of thy words. Remove not the old landmark, and enter not into the fields of the fatherless. For their Redeemer is mighty, he shall plead their cause with thee. I want to bring a message this morning on the subject, God's reality check. It's called living in a dream world. Those who live there think that the good times are always going to continue. These people think that only good things happen to good people, and since they can't find anybody that's any better than them, they think and expect only good things to come their way in their life. In this dream world, everyone loves us and is happy for us. And it's a world where there are no storms, no worries, and no troubles. And unfortunately, most people are guilty of creating a dream world where they constantly are trying to escape to, thinking that they're one day going to reach that time in their life where everything's going to work out fine. Maria was born into a life of privilege. Her parents were the king and queen of Austria, which meant that all that she knew about life was what she saw in the palace, where she was spoiled and pampered. One day she was informed that in order to help her country, she would need to marry a young man who would one day become the king of France. And with that, Maria moved from the palace in Austria to a new one in France, and in hopes of being accepted by her new subjects, she changed her German name to a French one, Marie Antoinette. So what did she find in her new home and in her new palace? There she found lots of parties, a lot of new clothes and new hairstyles, and she quickly settled into this new life of luxury in France. And she had, in fact, arrived in her own private dream world. She spent enormous sums of money on furnishings in the palace, on new dresses, and on living in high society. In fact, 7% of France's gross product, as far as their income, was spent on living in the palace. Well, while she was enjoying her life as a new queen of France, something was happening outside the walls of her palace. The French people were starving. Riots were breaking out because these people, many of them, didn't even have bread to eat. And as the people watched their new queen from a distance, they began to blame her for their poverty, for their hardships. They hated their lives, and they began a whispering campaign against the queen and her wild spending. And before long, there were stories about this German-born queen. And they continued to spread the most vicious lies simply because there are some people in this world who live to hate. She was accused of being a traitor to France because she helped establish an alliance between France and Austria. She was accused of having affairs with a variety of men and women. Her children were branded as probably being illegitimate. And to add insult to injury, rumors were spread that she was guilty of incest with her oldest son. A spirit of lawlessness was sweeping throughout the French regime, and there came about this uprising that would be called the French Revolution. The palace was attacked. The royal family was placed under house arrest, and finally a kangaroo court was convened to pass judgment. This is when the guillotine came into favor. And during this time, thousands of heads were lopped off in a matter of weeks. The king was found guilty by the court. He was executed by beheading. When Marie Antoinette was told of his death, she fainted. And over just one night, her hair turned white because of the stress. Then came what many had waited for, and that was the trial of the queen herself. She was convicted of treason against France and sentenced to die under the blade of the guillotine as well. It's been said for hundreds of years that when she was told that the people in Paris were starving, that she had replied, "Let them eat cake." While the haters loved to hate her, the truth of the matter is that she was involved with a lot of charities. She was trying to help bring about reforms that would help the poor people in the kingdom. In addition to raising her own 4 children, natural born, she also adopted 4 others. See if this sounds like a selfish, proud woman. One of her adopted kids was named Armand. He was a poor orphan that she took from the streets of Paris, adopted him, and brought him into the palace to live with her. Jean was a black slave that had been given to her as a present. She gave Jean his freedom, adopted him as well. Ernestine's mother worked in the palace for the queen as one of her servants. Ernestine, as a child, was a playmate for the queen's children. And when Ernestine's mother died unexpectedly, Marie Antoinette adopted her as her own daughter as well. Zoe was another girl whose father worked as an usher in the palace. When both of her parents died, Marie Antoinette adopted her also as one of her own. What Solomon is here trying to tell his son is that as Marie Antoinette found out too late, things are not always as they appear or as we want them to be. You see, there is no dream world to be found outside of Jesus Christ. And even then, it'll be after the Lord's return and after his 1,000-year reign and after the devil is cast into hell and sin is no longer present. That's when the dream world kicks in. But for you and I, and here and now, the only thing that matters is the reality. And realities can sometimes be rather cruel and sometimes harsh. And whether we like it or not, reality is what we must learn how to deal with. As a Christian in this world, Solomon is trying to help us to understand the reality whether we see it or not, or whether we like it or not. Verse number 1, the first reality check given by the Lord is this: whether we like it or not, we all live in glass houses. When thou sittest to eat with a ruler, consider diligently what is before thee, and put a knife to thy throat if thou be a man given to appetite. Be not desirous of his dainties, for they are a deceitful meat. There is an old story that has circulated for years about how Henry Ford used to hire or promote key employees in his company. He would invite this individual out to a meal. And he made sure that at this meal, they were always given a bowl of soup. The whole point of this luncheon was not to be nice. It was so that Henry Ford could size them up. The lunch was so that he could evaluate them. Should I give this person a job? Should I promote this individual and give him more influence in my company? So how did he evaluate them? He watched them eat. He was looking for one thing in particular. When they came to the soup, did they add salt before they tasted it or after? Now, there are some people, they like their food salty, and so it doesn't matter what it tastes like. They're not even going to bother. They'll just throw the salt on there, assuming that it needs it. Henry Ford was not interested in any key player to be in his company who worked on assumptions without knowing the reality and the truth. And so if this individual threw salt on there without even tasting it, he wouldn't hire them. They were never promoted. And the reason was because this kind of a person could be dangerous to his profits because he wanted people that were interested in reality and not assumptions. Solomon had probably done the same thing himself. He used a casual time when a person was not expecting it to evaluate them, to put them under the microscope, to size them up. And what Solomon is telling us is that the world is going to do the same thing to you and I. Are you aware that your neighbors are checking you out to see whether you're coming to church on Sunday morning or not? They're watching you. Why is that? Because we live in glass houses, whether we like it or not. That is the reality that Solomon is trying to help us to grab hold of. As Christians, for you and I, there are no unguarded moments. We don't have the right to go down to Walmart and be rude to the person that's ringing up the purchases because we're having a bad day, because they just might know who we are, even though we don't know who they are. Our Christianity this morning is always on display, and we're responsible for people judging the Lord based on their judging us first. And therefore, when you're invited out to lunch by the king, keep in mind that you're not there to eat a meal because he likes you. You're there because he wants to observe you. He wants to critique you. Just like Marie Antoinette was critiqued very harshly by the masses in France. And because you are a Christian, they're not looking for your strengths. They're not looking for the good things about you, but rather they're looking for your worst so that they can criticize and gossip. The reason is because the world is operating under the powerful influence of Satan himself. He hates everything that's associated with God. That's going to include you and I. And if the devil can make you and I look bad, then he knows that he's making the Lord look bad as well. Many of you have heard the story of when Gandhi of India was a young man. He became a lawyer, passed the bar. He went to South Africa there to carve out a career for himself. As a lawyer in South Africa, he starts pondering his future as in eternity. And he starts to wonder, what kind of a religion should I place myself under to determine the kind of person I'm going to be and the kind of eternity that I one day enjoy? He started reading books about Christianity. He read about Jesus Christ, the crucifixion, the resurrection. He came to the place as a young man, he decided to become a Christian. And years later he wrote, I decided to become a Christian until I met one. He had somehow run across a person who claimed to be saved, but they had a horrible testimony. They were a poor example of what a Christian is to be, if they were even saved at all. And one Christian, or one person who claimed to be so, was responsible for Gandhi choosing to become something else. Now, we like to make a big deal out of how wonderful heaven is going to be. But I got news for you. There is this thing called the judgment seat of Christ. That's where every saved person will one day appear. And my personal belief is that God is not going to allow us to see just the good things that happen in our lives. But I think that He just might pull back the veil and show us people who are now in hell because they saw how we were living as a Christian. The world's watching. They're not looking at us to admire us. They're inspecting us. They're evaluating us. They're trying to determine how real God is in our lives. And the truth of the matter is, the shame of the matter is, that when a lost person catches us on a bad day, and they hear something that we said, or they see something that should not have happened, it just might be that that sealed their decision. I don't want what they've got. And we, in fact, could be responsible for somebody being in hell. And so Solomon is trying to help us understand, you know what? You don't have the right to live your life as you please. And the reason is because we all live in glass houses. So you better be careful. If you have those wrong kind of fleshly, sinful appetites, you better put a knife to your throat, realizing that you're going to one day answer to God for allowing those appetites to get the best of you. Verse number 4, circle the word rich in this verse. Second thing this morning is this. We have been given, whether you like it or not, faulty yardsticks. A yardstick is used to measure things. And the world is all too quick to pass us a yardstick to measure ourselves by, and that yardstick is not accurate. Verse 4 says, labor not to be rich, cease from thine own wisdom. Wilt thou set thine eyes upon that which is not? For riches certainly make themselves wings, and they fly away as an eagle toward heaven. The wisest man in the world, because of God's blessings on his life, also became the richest man in the world. And what kind of advice did the richest and wisest man have to offer this generation? His advice was, don't sell your soul to the devil in order to have more money, because you'll never have enough. He says, labor not to be rich. The word labor in that verse means to be exhausted, weary, to be so consumed with making money that you faint in the process. Well, why would anybody push themselves that hard in order to get rich? The reason is because the world has created a yardstick whereby we're supposed to measure how successful we are in life. And their yardstick is measuring our success in how much money we have. And so the world is always promoting, look how successful this person is because they have so much money. Ultra successful people like Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, LeBron James, Michael Jordan, Tom Cruise, and so many others are viewed by the world as ultra successful for one reason, and that is because they happen to have a lot of money. They're rich. And that is the only yardstick that the world wants to use to determine successful people in this world. This faulty yardstick, I think, is one of the biggest reasons why the Lord chose to be born into a blue-collar family. This mom and dad had a lot of kids to raise. Dad had to work as a carpenter to keep food on the table. The family that Jesus Christ was born into was not wealthy. They had plenty of bills to pay along the way. And this was a family that knew how to work long, hard hours to make an honest living. But you see, the world is not interested in that. That's why hard, honest work is not always financially rewarding. That is why the true measure of success, the only yardstick that really matters, is the yardstick of character, not wealth. I recently had to take my car to one of the auto stores in town to have it checked into. The battery was doing some weird things. Wasn't starting the way that it ought to. So I went to a parts store because I knew that this place, they would test it for free and put the battery in for you and the whole 9 yards. And so I went and had it tested. The battery came back. I already knew that it was bad, and it came back very marginal. Well, it was not even that good. And so I told the guy, okay, give me that battery. He rang it up and he said, okay, would you like to have it installed? You know what? It was hot outside. So I said, yeah. And so the guy grabbed the battery, put it on his cart, grabbed some tools, went out to my vehicle. And I'm standing there watching him change his battery, and I'm thinking, boy, it's hot out here. As he's changing the battery, he said, you know, these bolts that screw inside of your battery, they're kind of stripped. You want me to put some new bolts in? It was hot. And I said, yeah. Went back in, bought the bolts, came back out. He's putting in these bolts for me. Getting it all buttoned up and that sort of thing. And it was hot. And so I asked him, because I know some stores have a policy. I asked him, I said, am I allowed to give you a tip? He said, no. I said, okay. So he's getting his diagnostic stuff out of the car and that sort of thing. And so I slipped some money under one of his tools on his table, didn't say anything to him, and I left. You know why? The guy may not be a millionaire, but as far as I'm concerned, he was a success because he was showing some character. Character is the only yardstick in this world that matters. How much money a person has? Folks, I know that you've encountered these people before. There's people that are so dumb they don't know how to come in out of the rain, but they got money. It may be inherited. I don't know. Some people have a knack for it. But that doesn't mean that a person is successful. The question is, how's their heart? Character in this world is the only thing that counts. That is reality. Verse number 6. A third thing, whether we like it or not, whether you believe it or not, doesn't matter. Here's the reality. We are surrounded by evil people. Eat thou not the bread of him that hath an evil eye, neither desire thou his dainty meats, for as he thinketh in his heart, so is he. Eat and drink, saith he to thee, but his heart is not with thee. The morsel which thou hast eaten shalt thou vomit up, and lose thy sweet words. In other words, you'll always be on the short end of the stick. You're always going to be a loser when around this kind of a person. Solomon is now bringing us back to the dining table, and this time it's not the king who is sizing us up, but now we're sitting across the table from an evil person who is going to try and hurt us. Ted Bundy was such a compassionate person that he worked a job on a suicide hotline. People would call in and they're telling him that I'm thinking about killing myself. And he would come up with such a compassionate reply. He was talking people out of killing themselves because he was so compassionate. His co-workers described Ted Bundy as being a great guy who was enjoyable to work with. But when he was overcome with the desire to kill, he would put on a fake cast, looked like a broken arm. And then he would go out to his car and he's trying to load a kayak, usually on a college campus, and he's waiting for a pretty girl to come along, and he would ask this pretty girl, could you help me to get my kayak up on my car? And the pretty girl would, oh, that poor thing. He's got a broken wing. He's kind of cute. He looks pretty good to me. And they would help him, and then they'd disappear. One woman approached Ted Bundy. She found out who he was later. And she recalled the cast on his arm. She was asked to help him load that kayak. And so as she's coming around to help push the kayak up on top, she noticed that the passenger seat in his car was gone. That's when she started running for her life. Her life was spared. She later identified one of the worst serial killers in our nation's history. Edmund Kemper was one of those people that you just automatically liked. When he committed a crime, he felt so bad about it, he went down and turned himself into the police. When he was being interviewed, he was so polite. He refused to brag about what he had done. The detectives who were investigating this case, they later admitted the fact that when they were talking to him, they liked the guy. He was just a likable kind of person. His case went to trial. He was sentenced to prison. When he got there, he immediately became a model prisoner. He was volunteering to do things in the prison there, and everybody liked him. The other inmates described him as a stand-up kind of guy. So how did this friendly, nice guy end up in prison? When he was 15 years old, he was at his grandparents' house. He got into an argument with his grandmother. He stormed out of the kitchen, grabbed his granddad's rifle, went back into the kitchen, and she started hollering him, "Don't you go out and shoot any birds." He didn't. He shot Grandma in the head. Shot her twice more in the back. When Grandpa pulled into the driveway, because he'd been out grocery shopping, Edmund went out, met him in the driveway, and shot and killed him. When he was asked why, his response was, "I wanted to see what it felt like to shoot Grandma." And I shot Grandpa because I didn't want him to know what I had done in the house. He was declared mentally insane, spent the next 5 years in an asylum. The guy borders on being a genius. He memorized the answers to 14 different profile tests. At the end of 5 years, he convinced the asylum that he was normal. He had been rehabilitated. And so they turned him loose. And that's when he decided to kill his mother, cut her head off, stuck it in the freezer, and then killed, I think, 5 more people. That's when he then turned himself in and became a model prisoner. The point is that there is a lot more evil in this world than you can even imagine. Solomon is trying to help us as God's people to realize this world is corrupt, it is filthy, it is evil. Verse number 9. We must face no-win situations. Speak not, that's the advice, speak not in the ears of a fool, for he will despise the wisdom of thy words. You can have the truth. You can know the truth. And you can be so convinced that you can help people with the truth. But Solomon is here trying to help us to understand that there are some people in this world who don't want to hear it. You're not just wasting your breath trying to help them to see the truth and to see reality, but what you're actually doing is you're causing them to despise and hate you in the process because they will resent it. Speak not, that's the advice, when encountering this kind of a person. And the reason is because you're not just being helpful, you're actually bringing more harm to the situation than before. Do you know how to witness to a drunk? I've tried in my early days. You know how to witness to a drunk? You give them a tract and you tell them goodbye. That's how you witness. The reason is because somebody who is drunk is beyond that reasoning, logical stage. They may not even remember your conversation. You are accomplishing zero trying to get the gospel to a drunk. The gospel tract is not for them to read at that moment. It's for them to read when they get sober. When they come to the place where they can realize that there is a heaven and a hell. The problem that we have this morning is the fact that there's a lot of people in this world who are not drunk on liquor, they're drunk on worldliness. They're beyond reasoning. They're in a drunken stupor and think that they're in love with the world, and the funny part is they think that the world's in love with them. While many of you may not know what things look like to a drunk, I can tell you this, things always look better than what they are. When a person is drunk at a nightclub or in a bar, man, while they got that buzz going and they're drunk, things look so exciting and appealing. But you go to that same place when you're sober in broad daylight, it looks like a stinking rat hole. And you wonder, why would anybody in their right mind choose to be in this place? And the key is right mind. A drunk is not in a time frame or a mind frame of thinking right. The world this morning is in love with itself,
And those people who are bitten by worldliness will continue to search for that excitement, and they will resent, they'll resist, and they'll hate anybody who tries to tell them anything different. So what can you do with that kind of a fool? Pray that God would cause them to see the reality of heaven and hell. And unfortunately, the only reality check that comes about is typically brought about by either a tragedy or a catastrophe. It's when a person has lost everything that they're finally willing to look up. It's only when the world has abandoned them that they're willing to now think about Christ. It's when they have hit rock bottom that they are finally willing to listen. When a person is so full of the world, when they're proud and arrogant and cocky, you're not going to get anywhere trying to witness to them. What you need to do is you need to ask the Holy Spirit to guide you and to lead you to that person who has some issues going on in the background of their life, and they're so close to rock bottom, and the Lord allows you to be drawn to that person. That is the person that you can help. They're willing to listen. Verse number 10, last thing this morning is this. The reality is, like it or not, we have to walk through minefields, places of danger to us. Verse 10, remove not the old landmark and enter not into the fields of the fatherless. For their Redeemer is mighty. He shall plead their cause with thee. Now this is the second time that this warning about removing the landmark has been given to us. Previously, we used that to kind of point to the fact that we have beliefs and convictions that we ought to be willing to fight for. And you need to be very cautious and careful about anybody who's trying to take those beliefs and shift them, take them away from us, causing us to believe something else. But there is also another indication that affects all of us as well as the future of this country. And that has to do with anybody who tries to remove the landmarks of Israel. Any nation or individual who dares to take a position against Israel, trying to undermine their right to exist, is guilty of trying to move a landmark that God has established. A landmark, back in Bible times, we already mentioned this, it referred to land, property. But the idea about Israel is the fact that God is the one that carved out the land of Canaan, and He gave it to Israel, to His people, and we're told you better not tamper with those landmarks that belong to Israel. So how does this affect you and I? When Israel became a nation again in 1947, they were immediately forced to defend themselves because people around the world did not like those boundaries that had been established for this new nation. Their enemies were those who were trying to remove the landmarks. Specifically, initially, it was Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. In 1967, Israel was involved in the Six-Day War, and they were forced to fight Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. 4 other nations chose to volunteer equipment, money, and fighters, including Saudi Arabia. Instead of losing more territory, the borders of Israel were actually enlarged. In 1973, Egypt and Syria combined to fight Israel in the Yom Kippur War with the hope of regaining the land that they had earlier lost. In 1982, Israel again was forced to fight the Lebanon War, this time fighting against the PLOs, Yasser Arafat and his bunch. In 2006, they had to fight another war in Lebanon, this time over the ability to retain the Gaza Strip. And up to this very day, Israel has been forced to defend itself over and over and over again. And what they're fighting for are those landmarks. God has given to them a portion of ground. He promised it to Abraham thousands of years ago. He's keeping good His promise. And anybody that dares to remove the landmarks that belong to Israel will find themselves in a whole heap of trouble because they're not just fighting against Israel, but they're also fighting against God. So what is the best way to avoid these spiritual landmines that God has placed in Israel? Several years ago, I received notification in the mail that I was supposed to appear for jury duty. Went down to the courthouse there with a bunch of other people. They put us in the jury stand there, and a lawyer started asking us questions. One of the questions that a lawyer asked was, if a police officer were to give his testimony as to what took place, and the accused is giving their testimony, are you willing to believe the police officer or the individual, or are you willing to be open to either side? And they ask, if you're only willing to believe the police officer, would you raise your hand? I raised mine, and I was the only one. The lawyer repeated, are you telling me that you're willing to take the word of a police officer over a normal citizen? And my reply was, yeah, as a matter of fact, I will. He didn't like that answer. I didn't get chosen to be the juror. Why would I take the word of a police officer over the word of a stranger, normal citizen? I have this thing inside of me, and I'm not saying that it's only this way. I know that the police officers can lie. I know that they can be corrupt. But I also know that God blesses leadership. And I always line myself up with authority. Always. Am I perfect in that decision? No, but I can promise you this. I have a pretty good batting average as opposed to doing something else. When in doubt, do this. Find out which side God is on, and whether you understand the situation or not, just move over to his side and you'll be okay. Let's bow for prayer. Father, would you please bless our folks here this morning? And Holy Spirit, I pray that you speak to our hearts and help us to see and understand the fact that the world is trying to convince us of things that are not so, things that are not true. They're trying to cause us to believe things that are actually contrary to the Bible. And so I pray that you'd help us to commit ourselves, whether we understand it or not, to choose to line up with the Bible. May not be popular, may not always make sense, but the Bible is always right. That is our sole source of authority. And Holy Spirit, I pray that you'd help us to be very cautious about the world, and help us to rejoice and realize that we have been given the truth. Our heads are bowed and our eyes are closed.